I have a short amount of time with you, so I am going to operate in big cultural strokes. There's going to be very little nuance because I really want to provoke and agitate so that you have stuff to discuss. And what we're seeing in our denomination in Church of England is a picture of decline, which is why there's a lot of movement at the moment in the Church of England around how do we grow younger. And we know that in certain dioceses, if things stay as they are, the trajectory of decline, as Peter Voaz says, in 10, 20 years' time, there will be 0 noughts to 16s in our congregation. So I have quite a hard grip on reality, and I recognize that you will represent parts of the body of Christ where maybe you're not seeing that decline. And when you hear me talking about things, you might think, hang on, that's not our situation. So I recognize that, but I hope there's stuff that I bring here that doesn't assume my situation on you, but actually encourages us as senior leaders to look out at the broader landscape and what is going on. So I have this prayer that we often use when I'm working with clergy and church leaders. I realize that the stuff underlined is very small. What I'd love you to do in a minute is just join with me. Before I start talking about members of Gen Z, let's commit them to the Lord. Let's recognize that they're in schools and pupil referral units and hospitals and streets and remand centers and prisons all around this country. And let's bring them to God. So I'm going to say some words, and I'd love you to join with me. Made in your image, known to you and loved by you. And at the bottom, the underlined lines in the bottom paragraph, I'm simply going to read them to you in case you want to join in later. May our church become to them a safe space to experience your life, your purpose, and your love. May they encounter you in us. May we encounter you in them, and may it transform us both. So I'm going to read the stuff and you join me with the underlined. So we hold in our hearts the young people in our communities. Made in your image, known to you and loved by you. And we hold in our hearts the young people in our churches. Made in your image, known to you and loved by you. And we hold in our hearts the young people overwhelmed by life. Made in your image, known to you and loved by you. And Lord, whether our resources are plentiful or scarce, we commit to serving them more deeply. May our church become to them a safe space to experience your life, your purpose, and your love. May they encounter you in us. May we encounter you in them. And may it transform us both. Amen. Amen. Thank you. So I think when I'm looking at the picture of decline across the UK, I think our problem with decline lies in our inability, our struggles to pass on faith to the next generation, and our growing disconnection with the new generations who have no connection with church at all. And maybe you don't need the stats or for me to say that to see what's in front of your own eyes. And there isn't a quick fix to this decline. And it's not about changing up a different cultural reference or dropping the latest person into our preachers, although do that. But actually, that's not what is going to make a change. You won't suddenly have a room full of young people if suddenly we understand a lot more about TikTok. There's a recognition that something deeper has changed and is changing in how younger people see the world, and how this world is shaping young people and how they find and grow in Christian faith identity. And we've trawled at Youthscape a number of youth ministry and youth work journals across the world to kind of think, what are some of the things that we can say with certainty about members of Generation Z? What are some of the indicators that we would recognize about this generation? Well, they are generation online. They don't go to the internet to find a recipe and then leave the online world and make the recipe. They operate online. Now, interestingly, the latest research is telling us that how young people are operating socially online is how they operate locally. And I see that with my own teenagers and with my own youth groups. They want to engage with the people in their lives physically online as well, which is an interesting next wave thing to do with a global communication system, isn't it? They're generation sensible. We're saying way less atypical risky behaviours. Drug and alcohol use among Gen Z is definitely going down. Vaping, possibly on my estate, is going up. But we're seeing less teenage pregnancies. When I started out as a youth worker, that was one of the biggest concerns, that we had the highest rate of teenage pregnancy in the Western world. That isn't something that is concerning now. They are generation uncertain, and their behaviour and choices around staying at home longer, struggling to commit to what they might do next because they're uncertain if what they commit to will still be there when they get there. And what's the point of doing A-levels if you've just heard there might be T-levels, then you've just heard that T-levels and A-levels might be scrapped. So generation uncertain. Generation anxious. They recognise a lower life satisfaction. There's more mental health challenges. Among boys and girls, it's increased, although always significantly at the moment more among girls. And they're very cautious and anxious about their speech and their behaviour, particularly online, fearing they'll be judged in a public way that will stick. And one of the things that I find I still say, because it's good practice, but actually I don't need to say it in many ways, is when I have a group of young people of different faiths and none, I don't really need to say, respect each other's opinion. These guys own this in a way that old generations still sometimes need to be reminded. Generation non-religious. We're seeing a reduction in affiliation with religion and belonging to religious institutions. They tick non, N-O-N-E. It's the rise of the nons, not the rise of the nuns, although I do think revival will begin with the rise of the nuns. But the rise of the nons, young people who don't affiliate to any particular religious institution. And we're also seeing a loss in spiritual language. What does it mean for a generation when you lose the language for theological realities? Little side note, which is why witch talk is really interesting. So little films that are on TikTok. Kim Kardashian has about 9 million. There's over 36 billion films about witchcraft and spells and manifestations. And it's capturing a lot of young people's interest, curiosity about spirituality. But what's your language for talking about that? If you are growing up in a predominantly secular age that says there is no spiritual reality, but you've just encountered something in your bedroom that doesn't seem like flesh and blood because you've just manifested something and got a Ouija board out and had a seance. And suddenly the secular world around you only has one thing to tell you about that, and that's you're having a mental health crisis because you've just seen something that isn't there. And so we have a generation of young people who don't have a language to talk about their spiritual curiosity or maybe even what they are experiencing. And then generation justice, which is sometimes also referred to generation judgment. This is an incredible generation. Their consciousness has been shaped by global justice movements, Black Lives Matter, Me Too, the Greta Thunberg climate justice, and it goes on and on. But their activism also comes with harsher judgments against themselves and against others. And it's a standard they often struggle under the weight of. There's also a sense that if you say the wrong thing at the wrong time and you're not on the right side of history, or you make a mistake, or something happens in a relationship and that's online, that will stick forever. Generation justice don't have a theology of redemption, so they are generation judgment, and it is crushing many of them. So what does this generation do with institutions like religions, and what do they do with Christianity? And this is where I'm going to divide the room, because I'm going to bring some big statements that you can push back on. But this is what we're seeing in our research at Youthscape. This is what we're seeing on the ground. This is how it works out in young people's lives. We used to be able to, in the past, talk about youth culture as if all young people aged 8 to 18 live very similar lives. Very similar cultural lives. We don't talk about youth culture anymore. We talk about youth cultures. And there'll be some youth cultures where Jesus is right at the heart of it. And a young person's experience of life will be deeply saturated by Christian faith. What I'm talking about now are the dominant youth cultures in Western society. The largest youth cultures, the largest voices, the prevailing messages in youth culture. So here we go. Number 1, Christianity is irrelevant. And this is not simply about losing the culture of cool. We're just not cool anymore. I don't think the church has ever been cool. I'm absolutely convinced we are not called by Christ to be cool. We're called to be holy, aren't we? And holiness is always relevant, isn't it? Holiness is different. But it's more devastating than simply losing the culture of cool. It's that in youth culture, the dominant youth cultures, Christianity makes absolutely no difference to real life, and it doesn't matter. The question isn't really whether God or Jesus are relevant or real or historical characters or make a difference. It's just that God isn't in their imminent frame. That's from Charles Taylor, who wrote A Secular Age. He's a 90-something Canadian Catholic professor, isn't he? He talks about the imminent frame. God just isn't in youth culture's imminent frame. The second is Christianity is implausible. Secularism is a permafrost that permeates the whole of life. It's the bedrock of unbelief that erodes the possibility of faith. And it means that Christianity, for many in the dominant youth culture, Christianity fails to convince. It's not hot enough. A YouGov poll last December showed that those in Generation Z are more likely to believe in God than millennials. They're more likely to pray than the generation above them. But this isn't translating into them joining Christian communities or seeing that churches are a place where their questions about spirituality would be a good place to go. And number 3, Christianity is restrictive. Too much about doctrinal certainty, not enough about power, a prevalent idea that Christianity keeps people locked in damaging worldviews that cause harm and oppress people. And what we're seeing with the pagan boom, which Witchtalk is part of, it's the rise of non-traditional religions and spiritualities. It's all about a spirituality of supposed freedom, where power is in the hands of powerless young people. So what do we do with that? Because everything in me says, that's not true. But we do need to engage in these dominant ideas about Christianity. 20 years ago, if you were invited into a local high school as a priest, as a church minister, as a Christian minister, and you were asked to go and answer questions about being a Christian, probably, if you were even vaguely good at your job, which I'm sure you are, you would have had a whole row of 14-year-olds with really interesting questions about the afterlife, about death, about God, about suffering, about pain, and they would have come your way like fire shots. Now you go into a school and you say to young people, do you have any questions to ask me about faith? And often the answer is, no, I'm fine. I'm fine, thanks. And what is that? Is that because they don't have questions? No, of course not. But they're buried under layers of secular thought. They're buried deep under fear of getting the question wrong. They're buried deep under layers of when else in life do you ever get those moments to excavate those deeper questions in your life? But as well as this being dominant ideas in wider culture, which you can push back on, that's fine. What about within our church communities? What about young people who are growing up in church, who rock up every Sunday or Saturday when you gather together, who are part of Christian households or Christian families? What's happening there? Well, Barna, a huge evangelical research outfit in the States, have looked at why younger adults are leaving the church, which is different to leaving the faith, but why they're leaving the church. And they found 4 things. And again, this might resonate with you. It might be culturally too different a context to resonate with you and your tradition. But they found 4 themes, really. These young adults said, well, partly we walked away from church because what we were presented with was a Christianity that's really overprotective. There's a lot of fear behind the discipleship. Fear of contamination by the world. Fear that if we open up certain conversations, it will all go horribly wrong and unravel. A sense of demonizing everything outside of the church rather than seeing God's incredible world as something to be explored. Another comment was they felt that they experienced a Christianity that was really shallow, quite soundbitey, really clever gimmicks, good ideas, sweet little communication methods. But actually, it didn't help them see how their faith, how their Christian faith identity connects with every facet of life, and how their passions, their gifts, their abilities could be used for God's glory. It was lots about God, but less about experiencing God. They felt it didn't prepare them for real life. And then Christianity is closed, or Christianity is intolerant. They found that they just felt they couldn't really open up about the things they wanted to talk about. And then the last comment, number 4, they felt that the Christianity that they were presented with was doubtless, that they couldn't admit or express that their faith didn't always make sense. They felt that it was quite fact-focused, as if people could be talked out of doubting, quite intellectual and institutional. So there we go. I've dropped some huge things on you right there. I wonder what your response is. I wonder what resonates with the tradition that you're part of. I wonder what you recognize and what you would want to push back on. So now's your chance. Round your tables. How does any of this, I mean, it is the afternoon, you've just had a cup of tea, so I'd forgive you if you want to fall asleep. But how does any of this resonate with your own experience of young people and young adults? And what questions does this raise for you for how your church reaches, disciples, and releases them? We're finding that missionally, churches' response to this, and I'm going to say crisis, I don't want to keep banging on about the decline narrative, because Jesus built his church, not the stats. But one of the implications is that we find that when churches do engage in youth ministry, often they focus that solely on young people within the church already. We did a survey across church traditions in the UK. 3,000 churches respond to our request for information. So we need to be careful how much we extrapolate from this. But of these 3,000 churches that responded, 91% said they only work with young people within their church. Some of you are nodding away at this. They're only working with young people within their church community. And maybe are sometimes forgetting that these young people are part of generations and youth cultures, that some of this stuff that I talked about are really key drivers in shaping thinking. And so that is not a great picture, is it? This is from a different piece of research by influencers. This is Youthscape and Youth for Christ and the Church of England, Hope Together and Alpha and Church Army. 49% of the youth workers they surveyed told us their churches had no active disciples from a non-Christian home. So the only young people they had in the church come from homes where 1 or 2 adults in the household have the faith and have passed it on. And one of the challenges that we find on our housing estate in the north of England is that, apart from our daughter, none of the teenagers who are part of our church community come from households of faith. All of them get up before their families are up on a Sunday morning, make their way into church, are part of our church community, and none of them come from households of faith. So we're seeing something quite radically different, and it is challenging in terms of discipleship. It's incredible in terms of discipleship, but it's a new kind of space for us. All these incredible young people that are our youth group, we are the only people in their lives that are modeling Christ to them in an intentional way. They'll have wonderful teachers, some of them at school. They might have other family members who've been praying for them. But in terms of their active discipleship, they don't come from households of faith. 39% of youth workers told us their church youth ministry was focused solely or mainly on retention. And there's a great book called Faith Generation by a brilliant guy called Nick Shepherd. He says this: Christian communities, churches need to engage in, these are some of our young people, by the way, in deliberate strategies that help foster intentional Christian communities within which children and young people and young adults can form and sustain Christian identity. Both those that are growing up within the household of faith and need to ask those big questions. Is this an owned faith? Is this my faith? Or I've just inherited the faith of my family? And those from with outside. The challenge of choosing a personal faith involves negotiating the depth to which being a Christian is ingrained into their sense of identity. Being able to own this as they develop a more independent sense of self and holding and expressing this aspect of who they are in environments away from the church. And I put to you that young people choosing a Christian faith identity is not simply a one-off experience, although for some of them they might well be able to point to a time where something switched on inside them, the lights went on and they chose Christ and he chose them. But holding faith in a secular age requires young people to choose continually. And I am not a church historian, so I defer to all those in the room who are way more academic and skilled than me. But I kind of pick up from the early church catechesis that that's one of the questions that was regularly brought. Do you choose Christ? And I think sometimes in my tradition, an evangelical charismatic tradition, we've sometimes said it's that one time. And we forget that for young people and for all of us, today I choose Christ. He chooses me. So one of my main messages with young people who I disciple is, today, how do you know that Christ he's loving you today? And how today are you choosing Christ? Not in a kind of a shame thing of, oh no, you got it wrong. But what does it look like? How has your faith made a difference in how you've lived today? So I have for you, I suppose it would be called 8 to be great. So 8 thoughts around leadership of churches or the posture of churches that wants to take seriously this challenge, this invitation of passing on faith to the next generation. This generation, we don't want to use the next generation language, do we? So what might be 8 to be great? So number 1, create intergenerational trust. There's a stereotype in British culture that teenage experience is all about conflict between generations, and maybe some youth cultures hold that more than others. And we do need to recognize within our church structures where generations are holding on to power and not releasing leadership to younger generations. But I think where we center the fact that we are the family of God, that generations learn best when 2 or 3 generations are in the same space. That's a beautiful gift. And we're discovering that on our estate in Blackburn. We do sometimes do things that are just for young people. But I would like 97-year-old Joyce, who has buried 3 of her children and her husband, who was an ex-mill girl, who understands what it means to hold on to Christ in the darkest of times. I've seen her sit next to 13-year-old Kenzie when his grandpa died. And Kenzie is in pupil referral units. He's often in trouble with the police. He's one of the most vibrant young people we have in our group. And I saw them sit together and I watched Joyce's beautiful faith over many years embrace Kenzie's chaos. And I thought, who Kenzie needs right now is 97-year-old Joyce and what she knows of Christ. So intergenerational trust, which is more than all age slots, people. It's about how do we learn together? How do we grow safely and with our safeguarding practice? That's the heart of our gospel, isn't it? It's not, safeguarding is not an add-on. It's the heart of how we keep everybody safe. But creating intergenerational trust. And then demonstrating protective power. Young people are primed. One of the great gifts they are to us is they have a brilliant way to reflect on how power is used and abused. If you sit down with a bunch of young people and read stories with them, like the story of the Samaritan woman, one of the struggles they have is that Jesus is a man with power, and he seems to be calling out for this woman who has very little power, all the things that she's done wrong. It's really interesting how they observe the use of power. And of course, there's something incredible happening in that story. But I find that always very interesting when I read these stories through the lens of how young people reflect on power. So churches that demonstrate that spiritual authority is found on our knees and demonstrated with compassion. We have a theology of power. We have a theology of redemption. Number 3, a brilliant posture is that we are communities that stir curiosity. We excavate buried spirituality. One of the things that we do on our estate is we literally light lots of fires. We light little bonfires in safe little spaces, but try not to make it look too safe because that's really boring for young people. And we stand around these fires and we talk about things that hurt. And when a number of them came to talk to me about ghosts that they're all seeing on a particular street in our little part of Blackburn, we talked about it. And we talked about power. And forgive me if this is offensive the way I'm going to phrase this, but we get somewhere brilliant in the end. One of our very young youth workers said to me, Rachel, they're seeing stuff. Like, they're not really interested in Jesus yet, but they're seeing stuff in their bedrooms, horrible apparitions and stuff that's going on. These young people have seen violence, and many of them are highly traumatized. So it's hard to know quite what is going on there. And he said, he was like, and he's a man that loves Jesus and worships Jesus. He said, we just need to, like, Rachel, what's like a Christian seance? Can we do a Christian seance? And I said, Ethan, it's called inviting the Holy Spirit. He said, yes, that's what I meant. But I knew what he was saying. He was saying, in this moment, we don't want to be presenting young people with a kind of a Christianity that's so safe. We want to be helping them see the power because they're encountering a power. We want them to encounter the power of Jesus, not a muted, safe faith that starts at 10 a.m. and finishes at 11:30 a.m. with coffee. Do you know what I mean? That's what he was getting at. So stir curiosity, get those moments, and then practice faith. And this is what I learned greatly from some of the traditions, the Anglo-Catholic tradition in Blackburn. I'm learning greatly from them how they involve young people in the Eucharist. But young people are learning faith through practicing faith. So one of the things that we do with our guys is we practice forgiveness. And we practice generosity. And we realize that forgiveness is really hard. And it is really tough on communities where somebody's mum runs into your house with a machete and your families will never speak to each other, but you want to play with the kid in that house. And you both come to the youth group. How do you practice forgiveness? And many of you here will come from nations and countries where you have seen and you absolutely know way more than me about this stuff. But what we've discovered is as we begin as young people to practice forgiveness, that throws some incredible light on what Jesus does. And he says, forgive, Father, forgive them. So, practice faith. Number 5, center the mission. These are some of our youth workers. Center the mission. We are a family on a mission. And when you're on a mission, you all have a role to play. You don't wait for someone to get to a certain age and go through enough courses. You're all on the mission together. So churches that center the mission, the outward-looking nature of our churches grow. And then layer up the context. Layer up the context. Scripture is challenging for young people that don't have a theological language or understanding of these stories. And it's so interesting how they theologically reflect on these stories. So we're trying to preach at them less and theologically reflect with them more. So the Zacchaeus story. I had a conversation with some young people and I was asked this as Youthscape, what's going on in the story of Zacchaeus? And the group that I was speaking to were absolutely convinced that Jesus was gullible. Why is Jesus gullible in this story? Well, because Zacchaeus says that he's going to pay back everything that he's owed, but we don't actually see him do it. He's all talk, he's all trouser, no leg. Who's that like? Trump. Trump's like that. People in power, they're like that. So Jesus is gullible because he doesn't ever ask to actually see the dosh. And then he goes to his house and he's like, and then it began to switch because then one of the young people said, my dad's like that. My dad's unsavable. And then there was a conversation, and suddenly the whole situation moved, and we asked, so if Jesus said he was going to come and see your dad for dinner, and your dad is unsavable, but Jesus wants to go and see him, what does that now say about Jesus? Really interesting conversation. So how do we preach and theologically reflect with Gen Z is going to be one of the most beautiful pieces of work of our age, I think. And then lastly, and for those that you are very clever have noticed, these are 7, even though I put 7 and 8. Only 7 comments, those that make taking notes. Churches, the posture is storm-proof peace. Young people have a profound awareness of mental pain. And we worship a God who has authority over the waves and the wind and the waves, but who often waits until the 4th watch of the night to walk to us. And I think our leadership of churches and with our youth ministry and serving among young generations and releasing them into leadership, we're walking across the waters to Jesus, and we're inviting young people to join us. And do you know what? We're watching them take more bold risks than we ever did. So churches that create spaces where young people entangled in an age of anxiety hear Jesus say, my peace I give you. So those are a few thoughts. Why don't you turn to the person next to you and just reflect with them, where's your head at? What one of those comments resonates with you? And then if we have time, there'll be a little bit of Q&A. But I think it's more important you reflect. So chat with the person next to you. What resonates with you from those